Okay, so today we're taking a deep dive into global politics.
Yeah.
We're trying to grasp the big picture,
Hmm.
where we are, how we got here,
Right.
and what it all might mean.
It's a big one.
It is a big one.
Yeah.
And to help us navigate all this, we're going to be using political scientist Lu Yu's book, The Art of the Possible.
This is a really fascinating work. One of the things that makes Liu Yi's approach so interesting is her use of comparison,
Yeah.
looking at different countries and historical periods
Okay.
to reveal patterns and possibilities that we might not otherwise see.
I mean, and that's what's so cool about this book right off the bat.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it kind of starts with this almost mind-blowing claim
Uh-huh.
that we are actually living in a historically peaceful era.
Right.
I mean, when you turn on the news and you see what's happening in, Ukraine, or you see, the conflicts that are going on in Africa.
Right. It feels like everything is going up in flames.
Yeah, like the world is falling apart.
But this is where the data gets really interesting.
Because Lu Yu isn't just, putting this out there as an opinion.
Right.
She backs it up with actual data from scholars like Max Roser and Steven Pinker,
Oh, interesting.
who've looked at long-term trends in violence.
Okay.
And they point out that war deaths per 100,000 people have drastically declined over the centuries.
Wow.
And, to kind of put this in perspective, think about the lives of your grandparents or your great-grandparents.
Yeah.
They likely lived through world wars, something most of us have never even come close to experiencing.
Right. Like my grandfather was in World War II.
Exactly.
It's just a completely different reality.
Right. And so it really does kind of shift your perspective a little bit.
But, it makes you wonder, is focusing on percentages really the best way to measure peace?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I mean, because, even if the percentage of the global population dying in wars is lower, the sheer number of people still affected by conflict is still huge.
Absolutely. And Lu Yu acknowledges that.
There's a debate among scholars about whether absolute numbers of war deaths are actually more important than relative percentages.
Right.
So it raises the question,
Hmm.
what is the best way to measure peace?
Yeah.
And can we even really talk about peace when there's still so many people suffering from violence and conflict?
I mean, it's complicated, but even just bringing up the idea that we are living in a relatively peaceful time is already pretty thought-provoking.
It really is.
And it makes you wonder, why?
Right. If we are experiencing this unexpected peace,
Yeah.
what's driving it?
Yeah, what's going on?
And this is where Liu Yu brings in a really interesting concept,
Okay.
something she calls liberal hegemony.
Liberal hegemony.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is where that comparative lens that I mentioned earlier really comes into play.
Okay.
Because Liu Yu argues that the international order that we live in today, when its emphasis on democracy,
Yeah.
free trade, and international institutions,
Yeah.
was actually shaped by Western powers, particularly the United States after World War II. And while this system is far from perfect,
Sure.
it has contributed to the decline in large-scale wars between major powers.
Okay.
And it's something that, we kind of take for granted living in this world. But it's actually pretty unusual, historically speaking.
Right. I mean, imagine if the Axis powers had won World War II, or
Yeah.
if the Soviet Union had prevailed in the Cold War.
Right.
Would we have this kind of, relative global peace that we have now?
That's a really good question, and it's something Liu Yu asks us to really think about.
Hmm.
Because the reality is that the peace we're experiencing is, in many ways, a product of specific historical circumstances.
Wow. Okay.
And one of the key documents that she points to is the Atlantic Charter, which was signed in 1941.
The Atlantic Charter.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this document
Okay.
is that it lays out these pretty radical principles.
Like what?
Things like self-determination, no territorial expansion,
Wow.
and promoting free trade.
Yeah.
And, back then, these were really radical ideas.
Well, I can imagine.
Because for centuries, the norm in global politics had been empires. Countries conquering each other, expanding their territories.
Right. Right.
And the Atlantic Charter basically said, we're going to try to do things differently.
So you're saying that the Atlantic Charter was basically like a blueprint for a new kind of world order?
In many ways, yes.
Huh.
And while these principles, weren't always perfectly applied,
Right.
they did become the foundation for the post-war order that we live in today.
Okay, so that's the positive side of liberal hegemony.
Yeah.
But, I mean, obviously there are downsides, right?
Of course. And Liu Yu doesn't shy away from those.
Okay.
She acknowledges that while this system may have prevented some major conflicts,
Yeah.
it also led to new ones.
Right.
The U.S., in trying to uphold this liberal world order, often intervened in other countries,
Right.
and sometimes with pretty disastrous consequences.
Yeah, I mean, you just have to think about Korea,
Hmm.
Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan.
Right, and you could argue that those conflicts are part of the legacy of liberal hegemony as well.
It gets really complicated, doesn't it?
Oh, it absolutely does.
Because on the one hand, you have this idea that, the system has contributed to a more peaceful world.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have these interventions, these wars
Mm,
that have caused so much suffering.
exactly, and it raises this question,
Mm.
is the era of American dominance ending?
And if it is, what happens next?
Exactly. And that question is even more pressing when you consider the rise of other powers,
Like China.
like China,
Oh,
exactly.
sure.
Yeah, Russia's flexing its muscles again.
It feels like the whole global landscape is shifting.
It is, it really is. And it's against this backdrop that Liu Yu explores another really important aspect of the current world order, globalization.
Okay, globalization.
Yeah, but what's so interesting is that Liu Yu argues that we've seen a really dramatic shift in perceptions of globalization in a very short period of time.
Oh, yeah, totally.
It's crazy how quickly things have changed.
I mean, like in the 1990s, the main criticism of globalization was that it exploited developing countries. Now, it's often people in developed countries who feel like they're the ones being left behind.
That's such a good observation, and Liu Yu explains this using a hydraulic analogy.
Hydraulic.
Okay, Rob's like water flowing through connected pipes.
Okay.
Globalization, she argues, creates this kind of connected vessel where wealth flows to where it could be used most efficiently.
Hmm.
And while this creates winners,
Uh-huh.
it also creates losers.
Right, because the water's got to go somewhere.
Exactly. And she brings up this really compelling research,
Has to
like
be.
the China Shock Study, which estimated that 2.4 million U.S. jobs were lost due to competition from China.
Wow.
And this study really sparked a huge debate about whether everyone actually benefits equally from globalization.
Yeah, because even if the overall economic pie is getting bigger,
Hmm.
it matters who gets which slice, right?
Absolutely.
And like you were saying, it's not just about economics.
Right. Globalization is about more than just money moving around.
Yeah.
It's also about the flow of ideas and people.
Right.
And this can lead to some really interesting and sometimes uncomfortable cultural encounters.
Totally. I mean, think about those heated debates about traditional Chinese medicine versus Western medicine.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of a cultural clash playing out on a global stage.
So globalization is like this giant mixing bowl where
Yeah.
all these different cultures and ideas are getting tossed together.
Exactly. And sometimes they blend really well, and
Right.
sometimes they clash.
And sometimes it gets messy.
Exactly. And Liu Yu points out that this cultural dimension of globalization can lead to a backlash.
Okay.
And that's not just an Eastern problem.
What do you mean?
We're seeing this backlash against globalization in the West, too.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Particularly when it comes to things like immigration.
Huh, interesting.
And she brings in this really unexpected case study to illustrate this point.
Okay, what is it?
Sweden.
Sweden.
Hmm.
That's so interesting because Sweden is often seen as like the model of social democracy and openness.
Exactly. But even Sweden is grappling with the rise of the far-right Sweden Democrats.
Wow, and what's driving that?
Well, a big part of their appeal is this anxiety about immigration and cultural change.
But Sweden has historically been one of the most welcoming countries to refugees and immigrants.
They have,
So what changed?
well, in just a few decades, the percentage of Sweden's population that is foreign-born has risen to 16.8%.
Wow.
It's a significant increase, and this rapid change has put a strain on their social safety net
Right.
and raised anxieties about cultural cohesion. What does it mean to be Swedish in this new, more diverse society?
Wow, that's a huge question. And it makes you wonder, I mean, is multiculturalism sustainable in the long run?
It's a question a lot of countries are wrestling with right now.
Yeah, and what are the trade-offs between humanitarian impulses and the need for social cohesion?
The tough balancing act.
It really is.
And I think these are the kinds of questions that Liu Yu wants us to grapple with
Yeah.
as we think about the future of globalization and the future of our world.
It makes you think, can we have both diversity and solidarity?
Yeah. Can we have both?
Hmm.
Or are those values fundamentally in tension? What do you think?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that one.
I think it's a question we all need to be thinking about
Yeah,
as we navigate this increasingly complex world.
for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but we're just getting started.
Oh, yeah, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
You've talked about peace, we've talked about globalization,
Shifting global landscape.
cultural clashes.
Right.
But there's one big question that looms over all of this.
Yeah.
A question that Liu Yu really gets into in the book.
Uh-huh.
And that is the question of democracy.
Mhm.
Is democracy itself in danger?
It's a question a lot of people are asking right now.
Because, let's face it, the news lately has been pretty grim on that front.
It really has.
I mean, you see coups happening.
Yeah.
You see democratic values being eroded.
Right.
You see authoritarian leaders gaining power all over the world.
It's a worrying trend.
It really is, and it makes you wonder, what's going on here?
That's what we're going to explore next.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a question a lot of nations are facing, and it kind of leads us to what might be the most crucial question of this whole deep dive.
Okay.
Is democracy itself in danger? You know, the news lately has been pretty grim on that front.
It's hard to ignore, really, coups happening, democratic values being eroded, authoritarian leaders gaining power.
Yeah.
It feels like the whole concept of democracy is kind of under attack.
Right.
What's going on here?
Well, to understand this moment, Liu Yu takes us back to the 1990s,
Okay.
a time of real optimism about the spread of democracy. Remember we talked about Huntington's third wave earlier?
Yeah.
Back then, it seemed like democracy was on this unstoppable march forward.
Right. It felt like the end of history, like Fukuyama said.
Exactly.
But now, looking back, it seems like that wave might be receding.
Yeah, and Liu Yu highlights two worrying trends:
Okay.
democratic breakdowns and democratic backsliding.
Okay, break those down for me.
So breakdowns are when new democracies collapse back into authoritarianism, often violently.
Oh, wow.
Backsliding is when elections continue.
Okay.
But the freedoms and fairness that democracy depends on are slowly chipped away.
So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, exactly.
Not only are democratic institutions collapsing,
Right,
but the core values of democracy are being hollowed out as well.
exactly.
Are there any places where this is happening in a really dramatic way?
There are a number of examples, but Myanmar is a particularly stark one.
Oh, man.
Yeah, they had this brief period of opening up
Okay.
with democratic reforms being put in place.
Uh-huh.
But then in 2021, the military just seized power in a coup,
Wow.
brutally crushing any opposition.
Jeez.
It was a stark reminder of how fragile democratic progress can be.
It's heartbreaking, and it makes you wonder, are the struggles we're seeing in new democracies just growing pains? Or is there something fundamentally wrong with the system itself?
Liu Yu has an interesting take on this.
Okay.
She argues that we shouldn't be surprised by how messy democratic transitions can be.
Okay.
She uses the history of France as an example.
Oh, okay.
Revolutions, coup, wars. It took them over 150 years to establish a stable democracy.
That's a good point. It's easy to forget that the path to democracy has been long and turbulent,
Yeah.
even in countries we now consider models.
Right.
So if these struggles are normal, what sets the success stories apart from the failures?
That's the key question.
Yeah, what helps some countries get through those transitions while others fall back into authoritarianism?
Liu Yu points to the importance of strong state institutions
Okay.
and a culture of democratic values.
So you need more than just elections.
Exactly.
You need the institutions to support those elections
Yeah.
and a citizenry that's committed to democratic principles.
Absolutely. It's a perspective that moves us beyond simplistic explanations
Right.
and helps us appreciate how complex these political transitions really are.
Okay, so strong institutions and a culture of democracy are key. But what about state capacity?
Oh, that's a great point.
It's not enough to just have democratic institutions. Those institutions have to actually be effective, right?
Absolutely.
They have to be able to govern.
That's exactly where state capacity comes in.
Okay.
It's all about a government's ability to carry out its functions,
Okay, like what kind of functions?
providing public services,
Right.
enforcing the rule of law,
Uh-huh.
managing the economy,
Yeah.
and responding to crises effectively.
So basically like keeping the country running.
Exactly. You can think of it as the operating system of a country.
Okay.
You can have the most sophisticated apps,
Yeah.
but if the operating system is crashing, nothing works properly.
I like that analogy.
It's a good one.
Yeah, it makes it really clear why state capacity matters.
Right.
It's not just about having good laws or well-intentioned leaders.
Mm-hmm.
It's about having the ability to implement those laws.
Yes. And to actually get things done.
Exactly. And Liu Yu makes this really interesting point about how the study of state capacity has come full circle in political science.
What do you mean?
For a while, there was this laser focus on institutions, on democracy and elections.
Right.
But then scholars started realizing that in a lot of countries, those institutions just weren't working as they should.
They weren't.
No, they were weak, corrupt, ineffective.
Huh. So what happened?
They had to go back to the basics
Okay.
and ask what makes a state strong, what gives it the capacity to actually govern.
That makes sense.
And that led to this renewed interest in the historical origins of state capacity.
Interesting.
One of the most compelling arguments Liu Yu explores is the role of war.
War.
Yeah, war.
How does war make a state stronger? I'd think that would have the opposite effect.
I know it seems strange,
Yeah.
but as Liu Yu explains, throughout history, war has often been a catalyst for state building.
Okay, but why though? Because when a country faces an existential threat, it has to figure out how to mobilize resources, collect taxes, build armies, and create a centralized bureaucracy.
So it's like a pressure cooker for state capacity.
Exactly. War forces states to develop the strength and organization they need to survive.
And sometimes those capabilities, that stronger state, persists even after the war is over.
Right. But Liu Yu doesn't just look at war.
Right, of course not.
There are other ways that state capacity can be developed too.
Like what?
Well, she points to the importance of things like a professionalized civil service, a merit-based bureaucracy, and a clear system of rules and laws that are applied fairly.
So it's about having good governance structures in place.
Exactly. These are all crucial elements of a strong and effective state.
It's like building a house.
Oh, I like that.
You need a strong foundation, solid walls, and a roof that doesn't leak.
Right. And Liu Yu looks at examples of how different countries have built their houses in different ways.
Oh, that's interesting.
For example, the United States developed strong state capacity relatively late in its history.
Really? Why is that?
Well, Liu Yu explains that the U.S. had the advantage of being geographically isolated with vast natural resources and a relatively homogeneous population.
So they didn't face the same pressures as other countries.
Right. They didn't face the same kinds of existential threats as countries in Europe or Asia.
Which were constantly at war with each other.
Exactly.
So the U.S. could kind of ease into state building?
Yeah, you can say that.
But eventually even they had to step up their game, right?
Exactly. And Liu Yu highlights how events like the Civil War and the two World Wars were major turning points for the development of state capacity in the U.S. They forced the federal government to expand its role and develop new capabilities.
It's amazing how these historical events can shape the way countries are governed for generations.
It really is.
But as we know, not all countries are so lucky. Liu Yu also explores cases where state-building efforts failed, sometimes tragically.
Absolutely. She uses the example of Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
Where decades of war and conflict have left the state incredibly weak, fragmented, and unable to provide even basic services to its people.
That's a sobering example. It reminds us that state building is a really complex and challenging process.
It is.
There's no guarantee of success.
No.
It makes you wonder, can you even have democracy without state capacity?
That's a great question.
Do you need to build a strong state before you can even think about having a functioning democracy?
That leads to a debate that Liu Yu really dives into. The debate over sequencing.
Sequencing, what does that mean?
It's the question of which comes first. A strong state or democracy. Some argue that you need to build a strong state first and then worry about democracy later.
So it's like, get your house in order before you invite people over for dinner.
Exactly. And they point to places like Singapore and China, which have experienced incredible economic growth under authoritarian regimes with very strong state capacity.
But that's the authoritarian model.
Right.
And a lot of people would argue that's not the way to go.
Of course. And there are others who argue that democracy itself can actually help strengthen state capacity.
Wait, really? How does that work?
The argument is that democracy promotes accountability and responsiveness. When citizens have a voice in government, it can push leaders to be more effective. And to address the needs of the people. They point to examples like India,
India.
which, despite its many challenges, has managed to remain a democracy for over 70 years.
So it's more like having people over for dinner can actually motivate you to finally clean up your house.
Exactly. And Liu Yu's point is that there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay.
The relationship between democracy and state capacity is complex.
Right.
And depends on the specific context of each country.
It's a reminder that political science, like life itself, is full of messy trade-offs and unpredictable outcomes.
Absolutely.
There's no magic formula for creating a perfect society.
And that's where the art of the possible comes in.
The art of the possible.
Yeah. Liu Yu argues that it lies in understanding these complexities.
Okay.
Recognizing the limitations of what we know.
Right.
And making the best choices we can, despite all the uncertainty.
So it's about being informed, being thoughtful, and being actively engaged in shaping the world we want to live in.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that there are no easy answers or guaranteed outcomes in politics. You know, it's a constant process of navigating this complexity and just trying to make things, you know, a little bit better, a little bit more.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And I think that's where Liu Yu's emphasis on the art of the possible really resonates.
The art of the possible.
Yeah. It's about recognizing those limitations, but also the potential for political action.
Yeah.
You know, understanding that history isn't predetermined.
Right.
We actually have agency to shape the future.
And that agency is both individual and collective, right?
Absolutely.
It's about the choices that each of us make as citizens, as voters.
As members of community.
As members of communities.
As global citizens.
Right. Yeah. It's about understanding that
it's all connected.
That the world is interconnected, that our actions have ripple effects, and that we have a responsibility to engage thoughtfully and ethically with these complex issues.
It's a big responsibility.
It is. It's huge.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, one of the most important takeaways from this whole deep dive from Liu Yu's book and from our conversation is that this process of learning and understanding never really ends.
It really doesn't.
You know, there's always more to explore, more to debate, more perspectives to consider.
And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, it is. It can be overwhelming, though.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, if someone finishes this deep dive and they're just feeling like, wow, the world is complicated, what would you say to them?
I would say that's a good thing.
It is.
Feeling overwhelmed means you're starting to grasp the complexity of the challenges we face.
Okay.
But don't let that feeling paralyze you.
Right.
The next step is to channel that energy into action.
So what could that action look like?
It can take many forms.
Okay.
It could be educating yourself further about the issues that matter most to you.
Right.
It could be getting involved in your local community.
Yeah.
Or supporting organizations working to address these global challenges. It could be having difficult conversations with people who have different viewpoints.
Oh, that's a good one.
It could even be as simple as being a more informed and engaged voter.
Right. Right.
There are so many ways to make a difference.
I think the key takeaway here is that we don't have to have all the answers.
No, we don't.
But we can't just sit on the sidelines either.
We can't be passive.
We all have a role to play in shaping the future, whether it's in our own communities or on a global scale.
Absolutely.
The world is what we make of it.
It really is.
It's up to each of us to decide what kind of future we want to build.
Well said.
Yeah.
I think that's a great note to end on.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into global politics.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
It's been a thought-provoking journey.
Yeah.
And I hope our listeners are leaving feeling informed, engaged, and maybe even a little bit inspired to make a difference in the world.
That's what we hope for.
All right, that's it for this week's deep dive. We'll see you next time.